surge arrestor. But it's certainly something that can be dealt with.
Isn't that an emergency kind of network? The ham operators and those that are using walkie-talkies, isn't that for emergency purposes a lot?
Well, I think it's viewed that the independent people who are ham operators will provide an emergency service if other forms of communications are not operating.
Okay.
I mean, they always try to help, and of course you hear stories where ham operators have helped. But it is true. It would be nice if they were available in times of an emergency. And like I said, it's not too difficult to come up with a protection scheme to protect their electronic equipment.
Could you do it?
Yes, we could.
Wow.
But we haven't had much interest. It's the situation that do you really expect a high-altitude EMP, most likely from a terrorist attack? And I don't know. I read the newspapers like everyone else does. It seems like there are some threatening countries and Al-Qaeda around that would love to do something like that. But whether it happens or not, it's hard to say.
What about protecting satellites in space? Do you have anything for that, or is that a whole other technology concern?
When a high-altitude EMP occurs, most of the electromagnetic fields are sent down toward the Earth. There are no electromagnetic signals generated in the upward direction because the radiation from the bomb has to go through the altitudes between 20 and 50 kilometers altitude above the Earth. That's where the field is generated. So in the upward direction, the air is thin and the radiation just goes out. Now, that radiation is hazardous to satellites, and also low-energy electrons that are ejected also are dangerous to satellites. So the satellites, especially low-altitude satellites, could have a big problem. And in fact, the EMP Commission, when they studied the EMP over the last 10 years on the infrastructure, they acquired information which they published that during the U.S. high-altitude test in 1962 in July, a test called Starfish, which was detonated in the Pacific about 1,400 kilometers southwest of Hawaii. At 400 kilometers altitude, nearly all the satellites that were up at that time were damaged. Now, that was a long time ago. There were not very many satellites. I think it was between 6 and 8. But it would be very damaging if that occurred. But that's not from the EMP. It's from the effects of direct radiation.
One would think that satellites that were made today with such sophistication would be purposed and set up for some type of event in space, but that's a whole other subject.
I think so. I think those built by the military would be, but I doubt seriously that any civilian satellite, communication satellite, would be built to be protected against this threat. Now, whether they would be damaged or not is a separate question, because the technology of the electronics is much different today than it was more than 40 years ago.
What do you think about police and fire, search and rescue, protecting their equipment right now and getting devices to them?
Well, I think it's important, and I think FEMA has been looking at that issue. But again, the problem is the high-altitude EMP is not considered a very probable event, and we're depending on our national government to protect us from that possibility, either through intelligence or hopefully if our missile defense system works. But I would say a second problem is from the terrorists on the ground who have shown interest in electromagnetic weapons, which can be built from electronics, from Radio Shack, and more sophisticated devices. That could be a real problem for people trying to deal with terrorists on the ground. For example, a situation where possibly some chemicals were dispersed, and then the emergency people went out to deal with them. And then from some short distance away, an electromagnetic weapon was used to defeat all of their diagnostic equipment, the things that would detect what kind of pathogen was present or what type of chemical was present. If that equipment isn't protected against these types of electromagnetic signals, our first responders could be at risk, and they wouldn't be able to determine the problem and deal with it.
Because it's invisible.
That's right, and it is well known from the way terrorists operate. They often expect responders to come and then to attack them, usually directly, but this would be an indirect method.
It would seem like it would be imperative to also make sure devices were at hospitals.
Yes, well, hospitals certainly
gas stations
need to have protection. I don't know. I mean, it's a question of how far you go. I think the fact that first responders are would be the ones dealing directly with terrorism. I think that would be the first place to look in terms of protecting. I mean, it would be very, very expensive to try to protect everything against every threat. You have to look at what's most likely.
What if, in fact, the federal receptivity is there, but the delays to do anything continue into the next 5 to 10 years? Because we're all sitting vulnerable to this, everybody. So instead of waiting, I'm not saying stop pursuing the federal ability to protect us against electromagnetic pulse, but can't we, on a parallel level, somehow come up with devices, or can you come up with devices for some of these applications where the people are willing to be responsible and take things to the best of their ability into their own hands and start preparing, like hospitals who might be willing to prepare themselves, police stations that might be willing to, other types of emergency responders? Isn't there a way to also have a parallel program going on until the federal government is really ready to move?
Well, I think that's a good idea, and in fact, we are trying to do that by letting people know we're available to do protection work. We've had inquiries and some projects with power companies, for instance, and it's because they want to at least understand the impacts that might occur to their system. The problem, of course, with the power grid is that to be an effective situation in terms of protection, you really can't protect just one portion of the power grid that is owned by one company.
Because it's all interlocking, right?
There are about 150 major companies that own parts of the power grid. And, the electrons run from one to the other. They are fully connected. The only way even a local power company would, if it did its own protection, would be if it had complete balance within its area of both power generation and power load. That being said, they would not be dependent then on anyone outside. But typically, that for economic reasons, it's usually cheaper to bring power in from another area. That's just the way our system works. So but I think your comment is a good one. We're trying to use that approach and to show that this kind of protection can be done. And the type of protection we're talking about has existed in general for many, many years to deal with special problems. For instance, businesses that are, say, close to a Navy base where a large ship may come in with its radars operating and cause severe problems. I know of a case of a radio station that had a hotel or motel built right next to it, and that when they opened that hotel, all the telephones were ringing all the time because the radio signals were so strong. They built it so close that the telephones were ringing. And so what they had to do is they had to go in, and there were filters and surge arresters that had to be put in. It cost them some money to do